Hi everyone. I wanted to show my technique that I was using to do this pin wash and weathering, and really sometimes it's a happy accident when you do this stuff because you kind of have to roll with the punches as far as doing things and saying, oh well, that looks dirty, I suppose that's supposed to look that way. So anyway, I just wanted to show how I was doing this. There's been a number of different suggestions on how to do it. What I found that works best for me is I have Artist Loft paint. This is the cheap stuff. I actually got the whole set, which is this stuff. I had my 40% off coupon. This was $5, so I paid, almost $3 for this whole set. I probably am not going to use some of the brighter colors, but the browns, blacks, dark blues, and greens will probably be pretty useful in most of the modeling that I do. And what's cool about this is I can leave it and come back to it. So you can see here, everything around here on my little disc palette is dry, but my little glob that I started with is pretty usable still. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just move this over here a little bit. And really this took some playing, and it's more of an art than a science, I think, at least as far as my experience goes. And I have a couple brushes that, I mean, they're okay brushes, but I'm not that upset if I mess them up a little bit. The other thing that I'm using, and there's probably a number of different things, I've tried turpentine, which I'd forgotten as a child how terribly bad smelling this was. I stunk up my whole basement just pouring it into this jar. It works great, but it smells really bad, which explains to me why they have a stuff called terpenoid, which is a substitute for this that painters use because they use terpenoid to thin this type of paint. Like I said, it smells pretty bad. Had to turn on my exhaust fan. It was pretty terrible. So what I'm settling for, and I've achieved pretty decent results, is this is Testra's brush cleaner. And actually, if you were to buy it now in the store, it would say brush cleaner and enamel thinner. It seems to have the right combination of not smelling so bad and the ability to thin these oil paints. Oops, I just dipped my brush in there. And it doesn't flow as good as the turpentine, but sometimes you have to make concessions. And not every process works for everything. So I'm just going to mix this up a little bit. I've experimented with a number of different processes to do this. I tried denatured alcohol, and this stuff didn't seem to work real well for me. It works really well for acrylics. But I also tried this flat black enamel. I'm going to go over this with a flat anyway, because I did paint this with Future. And the pigments are very large in this flat black. And I don't know if that's just a regular property of that or what the deal is, but the pigment that's in these oil paints, just artist oil paints, is really nice and fine. I'm just kind of playing around with this to see what looks right. How it looks like it's going to flow. And it tends to vary, at least in what I've done so far, on really just this half of the model over here. I'm just kind of mixing this up, kind of thin it out, and see what it looks like. It looks like it's going to flow. And then the next thing that I do through the magic of television, we're now closer to this model. And what I'm going to do is go through a couple of the steps that I've used to make this work okay for me. The first thing that I've done, usually, and I use this for cleanup and that sort of thing as well, is I paint my lines first with some of my solvent. So we'll start with these guys up here. And it dries pretty fast, so you tend to have to move pretty fast if you want the wash to follow the line. These guys are pretty important too, Q-tips. They definitely help in some of the cleanup aspects of this. So I may go through and do a little bit of thinning into what I already have. Your mileage is going to vary depending on how thin it needs to be and how it flows. And really the trick is to just kind of touch it a little bit, and it just sucks that paint up. I've seen people use smaller brushes for this, but I can't seem to get a small enough brush with enough bristles to pick up enough of the paint. So you can see that just kind of flows through there. So there's a couple ways I've addressed these dots. Either they become weathering. I just dip this this Q-tip in more of my brush cleaner, or I just come along and kind of clean it up a little bit. That's easier said than done because it's black and it smears. And a lot of times if you go over it with a cloth, you'll pull it right out of there. So you either have to let it dry for a little while or give it one of these treatments, and you see I'm smearing it around. So some of it's a skill thing, I would say, just because I've not employed this process in what I've done in the past. But this really speeds this detailing process along. I'm just going down in here. And if we have the solvent down in those lines, basically pre-painted them with the solvent, we can come back through and just with a light touch, it'll kind of suck it up in all directions. Just like that. Almost like drawing it for you. Missed. Sometimes your eyes deceive you when you're doing this stuff. And anybody out there that's watching, if you have other suggestions on how to refine this, I'm more than happy to get additional guidance on this, because this is really my first attempt at making a go at something this detailed. Most of the airplane models I worked on, prior to doing any sci-fi modeling, were they didn't have recessed panel lines; they had raised panel lines. So and the internet didn't exist, so I didn't exactly know how to do this anyway, or have a good resource, because I didn't have access to a lot of magazines and stuff. But you can see you can kind of clean this up, and if you rub it too much, it'll end up pulling the stuff right out of the curves, or out of the channels, which is what you don't want to do. But it's a pretty neat technique. I've been pleased with the results. I wasn't planning on a factory type finish for this model, so a little bit of black, a little bit of soot weathering, and I may end up rubbing some of this off anyway, because you can see this is a bit darker than what I have. I don't know if you can see it on camera, but what I have going on around it. but it's basically letting the solvent do the work for you, which is great because painting straight lines is definitely not my forte. You can just let the details of the model itself do the work for you. Come back down here. A little bigger dot that time. And since this is oil paint, it takes a bit longer to dry. So your working time is longer, but it takes a while before you can do anything else to the model. So I'm happy that this model is still in a couple pieces. I'm going to be starting the top half of this with this same process. There's a few more things that need to be done. So that's about it for now. See a little smudge action there. One of the important components of this is to make sure you coat this with Future or some sort of acrylic before you do this, because if you don't, you're going to run into flow issues. I could do acrylic with alcohol, and it seemed to work okay, but it really kind of stuck down in there. And when you started rubbing it, it would rub the Future right off of there if you were using alcohol. That was a real concern for me. I ended up doing a little bit more sanding work on this after the fact that I wanted to. So hopefully this helps anybody that was interested in seeing how this process works, at least in my experience. Like I said, this is a novice thing for me. I'm sure that there are a number of detailed modelers out there that have more experience with this type of process. So anyway, hopefully this helps our sci-fi fans and modelers united community and improves everybody else's model building skills. Thanks. Here's a quick after shot of how this ended up looking. You can see here, it looks like it's dirty, but it looks weathered as far as I'm concerned. So there's some of those lines, and actually some of the results that you may get out of doing some pre-shading work that I've seen done on airplanes that have recessed panel lines, where you come through with your airbrush and you brush each of these lines with a dark color, and then you go over with your lighter so it still kind of stands out under there. Is another neat effect that you can do. This, like I said, is my first attempt at this. I'm pretty happy with the results.